everyone, it's Dianna from Studio Upstart. Today I'm going to go through the 10 most frequently asked questions I get about startup studios. And this is actually an article I wrote a while ago, and I want to kind of just talk through these points because I think there's interesting new commentary to add and also provides a different listening experience for people. If you don't want to read the article, you can listen to this instead and get a little bit of extra information from me as I talk through it. And all of the information is all in the article, so you can check the data and the stats and all that stuff. Like I won't call them out here. I'm just going to go through and kind of state, what I've learned, my experiences, my opinions, things like that. So without further ado, let's dive in. 10 most frequently asked questions I get about startup studios. Okay, so here's the overview. A bunch of questions. You can kind of read through them, take a screenshot. What does a startup studio need to have before going out for investment? How much money do they raise on average? Who invests in them? What's the typical team size? How much capital do they commit to new ventures? How much equity do they take? Where do studios source their ideas and the projects they work on? How important is a thesis and how does a new studio craft theirs? What happens after a startup spins out of a studio and how do studios make money? These are the kind of like 10 most, prevalent questions I get from startup studios. But this is also interesting information for entrepreneurs thinking about joining a studio or working with one. So let's dive in. Question one, what does a startup studio need to have before going out for investment? My number one tip here is to have some traction. So you need to have something to show investors. It's not enough to just say, I'm talking to, a couple entrepreneurs. We're thinking about, doing something in the fintech space. Like if you don't have traction with some portfolio companies, and that means different things for different spaces, but you basically have to have some kind of idea of how you're going to get deal flow. What's your pipeline like? How many studio startups are you going to launch? How many startups externally are you going to invest in? Kind of the same questions that an emerging fund manager has to answer when they go to pitch investors or LPs on putting money into their funds. So, you really want to have some traction with portfolio companies. You need a slide that has a couple of logos on it or pictures of founders that you're working with and saying, this is, who we're building companies with, or these are the kinds of companies we're building. And this is our thesis. And, these are our competitive advantages, those types of things. A little bit of traction goes a long way. 2, how much money does an emerging studio raise on average? It's tough because, most studios go out and their goal is 10 million. Like I will say that the number one number that I see most often is 10 million. And then first time studio founder will land somewhere around 2 to 5 million. Unless it's an interesting area to investors, like a very hot, like I've seen some crypto startup studios start up and launch and raise a bunch of money right off the bat. I've also seen, health tech takes a lot more money and resources, so they tend to raise a lot more. But for like a typical B2B SaaS startup studio, the range is like 2 to 5 million that you can expect to close. And it typically takes about 6 months to close that funding, like to get it in the bank and everything. And that's if you have a strong investor kind of pipeline. And if not, it takes about a year. And so think about question number one with having to develop traction before you can go out and raise investment. And then going through the investment process is about 6 months. So, you're looking at about a year. And on average, you're going to raise like 2 to 5 million. And that should take you through like the next 18 months of your studio. And this money, I'll talk about in a little bit what, kind of the funding is used for. But you really have to have a strong thesis and a very good use of funds slide that talks about how you're going to use the money and what you're going to invest in. But to give you an idea of like what the bigger studios raise, and this is in the article, so you can kind of go read the data on it. But I mean, studios had an incredible funding year in 2021. They raised over $1 billion, I think, in March alone. Several of the big studios raised huge rounds, like $100 million rounds. And so it's definitely later stage studios raise a ton of money, and that can make an early stage studio feel tiny in comparison because you're like, I can't even raise $2 million and they're raising hundreds of millions of dollars in one oversubscribed round. But that's what all new studios go through. And it's really not that, rare. Like you're in good company if you're raising $2 to $5 million. And that's really all you need for your first studio fund. You don't need a follow-on fund right away. Like you just kind of need that money to be able to start building and investing a little bit in early stage companies and founders. So that 2 to 5 million range is where you should be at. So, what you're looking for are angels who resonate deeply with your studio mission or who have some kind of operating expertise in your domain area. So, if they're like fintech or if you have a mission, like your sustainability studio, those can be really good kind of angels to grab. Individual LPs can invest in funds in studios. And you have to think about when you're raising a fund for a startup studio, you're really raising, you're like an emerging fund manager. So think about it that way. People that invest in funds. So it's typically not venture capital firms, it's angels, LPs, fund of funds are a big one. Like Green Spring, Centrifuge, some of those are investing in startup studios. Family offices. Family offices is the other one that kind of regularly invests in the startup studio space. When is the right time to approach investors? Like I said, if you have some traction, you have some portfolio companies, you can show some logos, you can show some traction with the portfolio companies. So like, we're building with this one, founder and we are, that company has 100 users at this point or some amount of revenue. You can show some traction to the investors. They're going to say like, okay, like that makes sense. Like I get that they can get deal flow. I see that they're good at picking companies to work with. So that's kind of what they're looking for. So I guess when is the right time to approach them? It's probably like 6 months after you start the studio is the right time to approach investors. What is a typical team size and makeup for a new studio? So I always say that you need 2 people to start a studio. I have seen it successfully done with just one person, by the way. So I never want to like say this is the rule, you have to follow this. But with one person, it is really hard because typically you're going to be either an operator or a finance person coming from the venture capital side. I typically recommend that there's both sides. So someone who's raised a fund before, is very familiar with venture capital, understands the financial side of things, and then an operator, somebody who has built a startup, maybe built and sold a couple of startups, someone who can really work on the operations of the startup studios. Those 2 people are the kind of key leadership. Under that, it's really the sky's the limit, but like the team that you need to kind of cultivate very quickly, you're going to need to have someone who's in charge of like managing deal flow. And that can be anyone from like your internal, just kind of like analyst to someone more specifically focused on deal flow management, because you have to have someone to go recruit startup founders and kind of bring them through the process. And then I think you have to have EIRs like really right off the bat or very quickly after you launch and you start to bring on, investments to look at, because your startups that you bring on are going to need a lot of help in the beginning. And if you don't have the resources to help them, like if you don't have entrepreneur residences that can kind of lend a helping hand with like marketing or tech or go to market or sales, then your portfolio companies aren't going to find a ton of, value in your studio right off the bat. And if you're building companies internally, like I'll talk about in a little bit, but there's kind of 2 ways to do this. And most studios do a hybrid of the two, but you can either build internal startups or you can invest in kind of existing startups and bring them into the fold. If you're building internal startups, you need EIRs to build the startups. Like it's not going to be just you doing it. Like you have to have people working on all the various things so that you can stay working on the studio and they're working on building the portfolios within the studio. So that's kind of it. The 2 operators, like the finance person, the operations person, a couple of EIRs, and hopefully somebody managing the EIRs, like the kind of deal flow manager person. It's always great to have a tech person on the team. It's always great to have someone in marketing because you're going to have to, when you launch, you need to do a press release, marketing. How are founders even going to find you? So marketing person's always great to have. That's kind of it. You don't need much more than that. How much capital do studios typically put into the ventures they work on? I have a slide on this next, so I'm just gonna. Here we go. This is a graph from a white paper from GSSN, the Global Startup Studio Network. The white paper is called "The Rise of Startup Studios." It's great. If you haven't read it, go read it. Basically, what you're seeing here is the attrition, so like how ideas move through this pipeline, and then the stages of the pipeline, and then how much money is invested at each stage. And these are just like kind of general figures. It's not like a Bible, but it is like at the early stage where you just like have some random idea, like put $1,000 into it, just in whatever capacity, and validate that idea makes sense. The next stage is like 10,000-ish dollars, where you'll kind of try to build some MVP and just see like, does this does this work? Are people, interested in signing up for a wait list or something? That stage is around $10,000. You'll test the solution. That's kind of like building the fuller product. That's, $40,000. So we're up around, 50,000 at this point. And then once you start to get traction, you'll put in another 50 and just kind of build out the team. And once you kind of form the team, then you're making your investment into a fully formed kind of a startup. And that can be anywhere from like 50 to 250. And then, when you scale and there's follow on rounds, you're going to keep investing in them. So I typically say that, 100,000 to 150 is what you'll put into each portfolio company by the time it spins out. And that obviously depends on what industry you're working in. Healthcare is more expensive and harder. Same with biotech. B2B SaaS, super easy. Fintech, somewhere in the middle. So it just really depends. But like you should be looking at 100 to 150,000. How much equity do studios typically take from the startups they bring in? Another like super variable question. Typical answer here is like 30%. A startup studio is not a venture capital firm. It is not an accelerator. It's not taking 2 to 3%. It's not taking 7%. Like, it's supposed to be the co-founding member of your team. Like, you are coming as a founder or two founders who have an idea and you need some level of help and resources to build this idea out. A startup studio really is like your investing co-founder. And if you think about co-founder level equity, it's like a 30%. And a lot of founders don't necessarily want to give that up, but for all of it, it's the pros and cons. You have to weigh the advantages versus the disadvantages. Speed is a huge advantage of startup studios. So is connections and network. Like they could plug you into 3 people and you have beta testers and customers that generating revenue in 2 months versus the 2 years it might take you to do that on your own. So it really depends. 30% is kind of the standard-ish. I know some studios that take like 50-50, like we'll, go halfsies with you. And then I know some studios that take a lot less because they don't necessarily act like an investing co-founder. They act like your sales machine or your technical team or something. So they might take like a 10% equity. It's always a little bit higher though than accelerators. Like you're not going to get like a 7% equity take from a studio unless, you're like a repeat founder with like a really great track record and all of that. 7. Where do the startup ideas come from? Inside the studio or outside? I made this chart a while back. And so what I want you to pay attention to is a lot less on the actual names of the studios because these studios have changed their models since I made this. But basically, if you look at that third line on this abacus, there's a spectrum from all of our ideas come from inside our studio to all of our ideas come from outside of our studio. So most studios fall somewhere like right in the middle or at least skewed a little bit towards external. So if let's just say for a round number, they have 10 ideas that they build each year. 2 of them will come from inside the studio. 8 will be, early idea stage founders bringing ideas to a studio and like pitching them and then coming on. So just not from inside the studio. And some studios are like exactly in the middle, 5 and 5. So it really just depends on the thesis of the studio. But most, have some kind of a hybrid model. Okay, 8. How important is a thesis for a studio and how do we formulate ours? So a studio thesis is incredibly important. You can have a couple of different types of theses. You can have an industry thesis, like we invest in fintech, we build and invest in fintech companies, or B2B SaaS healthcare companies, or consumer payment companies. It's like the industry theses are, the most common and the most wide ranging. You could also have a thesis on the type of founder that you fund or back. You can have a thesis on the location, like Pioneer Square Labs in Seattle really invest in founders out of kind of Seattle. Like that's their, one of their pieces of their thesis. You can have a business model thesis. I've seen some studios just say, we invest in B2B. We invest in B2B SaaS, or we're a consumer tech company. And so it really depends on like what your studio members are the most experienced at. Like, what is your domain of expertise? Where do you have the most connections? Where can you provide the most value? If it's in an industry, that's great. If it's in a location, that's great. If it's in an ecosystem, that's also great. Like it really depends. A thesis is really important though, because if you think about what studios are, they are reusable resources and repeatable processes. Those are the two levers of startup studios. That's what makes them execution engines and speed scale machines. So if you are trying to build companies in health tech and retail, and then you have like another company that's building something in consumer social, how are those three companies going to share resources? It's just when you have a thesis, you can reuse business models, playbooks, you can reuse customer lists, you can reuse advisors, you can reuse beta testers. Like there's, so many resources when you have a focused thesis. And not to mention, if you're raising money from, any outside investors, they're going to ask you what your thesis is, and that needs to be rock solid. And they're not going to have any patience for, we invest in 50 different areas. They're just going to pass. So a thesis is very important. There's many ways to formulate yours. And 9, what happens after a startup spins out from a studio? Typically, there's a period where the studio is still involved. They are still helping to support in whatever domains they're kind of best at. So if they're really, really good at go to market, they'll probably continue to help with go to market for like the first 6 months. What happens is you phase out the members of your studio and you bring in hires, like you hire people to be members of the team. And as you raise funding for that startup, then the CEO now has funds to bring on a COO, a CMO, like a CFO. Like they don't need the studio for these resources anymore. The studio has people in place to help with those things and then pulls them back as this person, as the CEO, and the team hires, people to replace them. So a startup studio, work on this project for about a year, spin it out, then it goes off to raise money and then really operates like its own independent entity. And then once the studio members are kind of all off the team, then it's just a really great portfolio company out there running wild in the world. Last but not least, how does a startup studio make money? I have a slide. This exits. Exits are the king. So as you can see here, Dollar Shave Club came out of Dollar Shave Club, which came out of Science Inc., like sold to Unilever. All of these are startup studio companies. All of this first line or column are startup studio companies that sold to bigger companies, and the returns generated from those exits fuel the startup studio. So maybe they don't have to raise funding again for another like 6 months. Like Dollar Shave Club was $1 billion exit. Like that startup studio didn't have to raise money for like ever. And so like exits is the big one. That's how startup studios make money. It's very similar to venture capital. But I will say that there are other ways to make money inside of and alongside of startup studios, including working with corporate partners to build innovation inside of their corporations. And let's see what else. Services that you can offer. So if you're really good at go to market, you can kind of offer that go to market as a service. Like we'll do your marketing for you. We'll do your sales for you. I've seen RevOps as a service. We'll handle your kind of revenue. I'm going to be honest. I don't really know what RevOps does. I'm learning, but I don't know. So yeah, I mean, there's corporate. You could run accelerator programs and charge for them. That's also a good way to kind of vet new deal flow, make money at the same time. So you get creative with it. Startup studios can make money in a million different ways. And in the beginning, you're going to have to. So I'll tell you right now, it is hard to raise money for a startup studio when you are brand new, don't have a ton of traction, and have never raised money before. So exits are your golden ticket, but there are other ways that you should be thinking about creating a sustainable studio. Thank you for watching. I know this format was a little bit differently. Hopefully me talking through everything didn't just, go too fast and really confuse or bore anyone. The other thing I want to mention is join the startup studio community. It's over there. The link is su-build.com. It's free. You can join. It's got a lot of resources and a ton of members you can connect with and learn from each other and ask questions and share resources and all of that. So thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed and have a great rest of your day.